The first work of Pete Volkas's I ever saw, I thought it was the ugliest stuff I'd ever seen. In fact, it was so revolting that I couldn't get out of the room fast enough. But I couldn't get that work out of my mind. And I thought, I'll find out what this man is like, because I couldn't get this work out of my mind, and I was sure that I wouldn't like him, but I had to find out. So I did, and it changed my life.
I was trying to figure out what courses to take, and here's this ceramics class offered by Peter Volkas I'd never heard of. So I enroll in it, and it changed my life.
Yeah, Berkeley, you know, I call it the hotbed. There was just a lot of activity going on there. It was like the energy level was just incredible. I mean, Pete was sort of the nucleus, obviously, sort of, he was, you know, the reason, the cause of it all, as they say.
I did. I made it possible for a lot of things to happen, and I realized that. But I just took all that tradition that came from other places and made it our own tradition, you know, that something else was going to happen.
Volkas gave everybody the right to be themselves. His intensity of expression continues in the work of half a dozen people doing clay art today.
Having witnessed Peter Volkas heave clay into museums of high seriousness, Robert Arneson and the Davis Group scouted out less glamorous terrain. Inspired by Duchamp, Warhol, and the ceramic collection of the corner thrift store, they brought clay into the realm of the comical, the political, and the uncalled for.
The Davis Ceramic Group were perceived as being kind of sacrilegious to that religion that Peter Volkas and the Otis Group pioneered. It was the first sort of massive turn away from exploiting clay as a material in its earthy sense. And Bob Arneson, who was also influenced by Volkas, finally kind of broke through and began to exploit a whole nother arena of clay and glazes, and being influenced by pop art. The work, of course, was about imagery and the everyday object. Kind of all the things that were relegated to Sunday potters and things that our aunts and grandmothers seemed to do. They took that and began to exploit that, and people were really put off by that. So they were perceived as heretics.
The funk movement was an early 60s movement, and one of their first interests was to create things that were, shall we say, casually crafted. Other people would say they were made very badly. And in that way, they kind of thumbed their nose at the tradition of craftsmanship.
Well, I never heard a definition of funk that I thought was accurate.
No, actually, to this day, I couldn't tell you what funk is.
I think of George Clinton myself, but other people think of other things, you know.
Funk, yes, that is an issue.
I have no idea. The term to me is extremely annoying. I think the man at the Berkeley Museum invented it, coined it out of someplace, out of the snot-nosed attitude that was typical of the 50s and 60s.
There are a number of things that have been said about funk. First, it was California rebellion against New York. Secondly, it was a general, here's mud in your eye. Thirdly, there's an angry perversity to it.
Refers to a certain kind of brute, what we used to refer to as dumb.
When something was dumb, it meant it was good, but it was dumb.
You know, just sort of very clunky kind of imagery.
Kind of clunky. I mean, clunky, dumb, and funk, maybe those are all the same. I don't know if there's words for it.
It's more an attitude. It is the opposite of being very careful.
And just to make ironic, peculiar, and upsetting objects.
What was called funk art included a broad range of things, much of which had to do with social commentary and political commentary. We think of Bob Arneson.
There are very few artists whose works on the surface call attention to them, make you interested in who they were, who they are, etc. Arneson was one of these people.
Arneson had the guts to make himself his own subject. carrying that self-importance up to unspeakably obscene levels and gorgeous, glorious levels.
Arneson to me was almost like Peck's bad boy. You know, anything he could do to cause a controversy of some sort and say, geez, look the controversy I'm causing over a lousy little piece of art.
But Arneson seemed always to take ideas which we didn't face directly and force us to think about them.
Bob Arneson was an honest person, and in his honesty, he really wanted to delve into the human condition. And he believed very firmly that if that offended you, if what came out of that offended you, that was your problem and not his.
He had this joyous quality of stirring everything up in good humor. He made fun of people to themselves. He made fun of me to myself. He made me funny to myself. And he nonetheless was arrogant, patriarchal, an almost godly figure.
Bob started out working in ceramics when he was hired to be a high school teacher. And he just got like the Sunset How to Do book or whatever the How to Do book was then and kept one step ahead of the students. He got fascinated with the material and then went to Mills College under the direction of Tony Prieto, where he learned to be a very, very good potter in the image of Tony Prieto, which is what Tony Prieto demanded. And he got into a lot of trouble when he tried to break out of that mold, and he did break out of that mold.
Tony Prieto was a classic potter, and he couldn't figure out why somebody who had the choice to make something beautiful would choose to make something ugly. And he thought Bob's work was really ugly. And Tony just raved and raved about what's wrong with this guy. He can't make good art. And of course, Bob went on to become a very, very important artist.
I want to make the finest ceramics that I'm capable of and restore the lost dignity of this most ancient and noble art.
Bob Arneson set himself off onto the fringe of the ceramic community, and I think was proud of that.
In 1962, Bob took himself out of the ceramic community by virtue of the position he was offered as an instructor at the University of California at Davis. And he was teaching with people who were not involved in clay. William Wiley, Wayne Thiebaud, Roland Peterson, Roy DeForest. They were just artists, and Bob was an artist among them. So the expectations, I think, that he had of himself were quite different than someone who was involved all the time with people who were just working in clay. And he just left behind, or he just stepped aside from that world of making pots.
He essentially challenged, worked over, worked through, questioned virtually every aspect of what had been hitherto thought of as appropriate to ceramic art.
He was very aware of what Pete Volkas was doing. He spent some time in Berkeley. He would go down and visit Pete. But when he was invited to be in an exhibition, and he knew that John Mason and Pete Volkas and those people were going to be in there, he knew that the kind of mini Volkases he'd been making just wouldn't cut the mustard. And so he, as he would describe it, he really searched for a form he could use.
I think that he sort of knew for himself at a certain point the direction he was going. I remember distinctly one night when I was in TB9, and he was kind of pushing this huge ball of clay around the floor. There was a lot of stuff on the floor he picked up, dirt and pieces of clay and things that were there that all textured the clay very heavily, And he wanted to have it a certain way, but he couldn't quite get it. And I heard him cursing and, God damn this, and this stuff doesn't work, and, damn it. And he hung it over a table, and he punched it, and he just ranted and raved. So I just came around and asked him casually if everything was all right, and he says, get out of here, I'm trying to do this stuff. But it showed, the struggle that he had, that he was trying to get at certain kinds of things.
It remains today in my mind one of the most ghostly, haunting recollections, big exhibit, and there amid all of the Chinese pots, high fire reduction glazes, copper reds, temakus, so on. There sat this squat, ugly, wild.
He decided to make toilets because that's the ultimate ceramic form.
The first time I saw the ceramic toilet, you looked at, and then that was the end of it. I never got turned on by those pieces at all.
People were very upset by this. There were people certainly in the pottery world that were offended that he would do this with such a noble material. The vice president of Kaiser Industries thought that Bob was attacking American capitalism, and the piece was removed from the exhibition. It was a quite shocking piece in the early 60s.
Arneson consciously created controversy to draw reactions, and some people couldn't handle it, so to speak, didn't know how to do with it, couldn't go past the subject matter, which was very unfortunate because it was a very elegant piece. A great depth to them,
Bob could be absolutely offensive if he wanted to. Certain times he would get excessive and go over the line, but Bob didn't go out of his way to fit in with people's sensibilities. One of the charming things about him, if he thought something, he would straightforwardly express it, and the chips would fall where they might. He really enjoyed playing the role and being a provocateur.
His early work with the ceramic toilet and all the other objects were done for shock value. This was the ceramic people's way of competing with what was going on out there, was being as outrageous as they could be. I mean, Peter Volkas's group was outrageous when they were in the 50s, and so this was their way of the 60s of trying to see how far could they go with clay. They went pretty far.
Arneson vernacularized a medium which in its finished product has been associated with fine surfaces, whether you go from Ming vases to precious porcelain, it's always been a precious medium.
Arneson's importance to ceramic art exists on half a dozen different levels. One, he introduced the comic into the art.
Bob's sense of humor was a very elegant Three Stooges kind of humor. Was nothing particularly subtle about it.
Bob Arneson's typewriter was a very funny thing at first, and done in a kind of crude, spontaneous manner, not demonstrating all of the craft that Arneson had.
It's easy to just see the humor, and he liked that. He thought that that was a way to get people involved with the work. But when you look at a piece like the typewriter, it's often overlooked that there was a strong political element in his art from the early 60s on.
I suppose for contemporary feminists, look what this suggests, the woman as a machine, the secretary who's simply a part of the machine, a non-entity, a non-human being. Looking back at that now over decades, it has increasing significance to us, and that's one of the tests of good art.
Yeah, I think he was trying to jar people to think of ceramics as a viable medium. It's just another thing like wood or plaster. It's not something you make pots out of. So he probably had to go a little, or did go overboard on that a little bit, just trying to make a point.
In the early days, Bob didn't take himself as seriously as he did later. Usually, he had a certain sense of irony and could laugh at himself. But occasionally, he'd go out of the way, I think, to needlessly stir up a hornet's nest. There were a number of instances that Bob's proclivity to stir up things got him in deeper than he thought he would get at first.
Of course, this resulting finally in his piece about the assassination of Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco, in a way that we hated really to think about it.
1023 for one moment. We're trying to ascertain what has happened.
As president
president of the Board of Supervisors, it's my duty to make this announcement. Both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed.
Dan White, in a fit of anger, went into City Hall and gunned down George Moscone, the mayor, and Harvey Milk, the supervisor. There was a call for proposals for public pieces to be placed in the George Moscone Convention Center.
Once I got started on the piece, a lot of people came forth who knew him personally, and a lot of anecdotes and stories and about the man, and he seemed like someone I might have known, and I got very comfortable working on the piece.
So he makes the portrait. He made a drawing of the portrait which showed a blank pedestal. Now everybody who knows Bob's work knows he didn't make blank pedestals, but anyway, in this drawing, the pedestal was blank. Mrs. Moscone came and looked at the head, and she patted it and said, "That's George." And Bob felt really wonderful about that. Bob did not show her the pedestal.
I don't know if Bob ever actually said as much, but I knew him well enough, speaking between the lines, that deep down he knew the writing on the base and so forth would stir up a hornet's nest, as it were.
This is what sent city officials into a mild frenzy when it was unveiled last night. A bust of the late mayor, George Moscone. Not the bust itself, but the pedestal upon which it sets. The pedestal depicts various stages of the mayor's life and his murder. The lower portion of the pedestal includes an outline of Moscone's body, a likeness of the weapon used to kill him, blood-like splatters, bullet holes, the words bang, 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 and the name of Dan White. The widow of the late mayor doesn't like it, and city officials want it removed or redone.
People got very upset immediately. I mean, the next day, the mayor called, and people were Mayor Feinstein called. I'm not sure all the reasons people were upset about that piece.
I appreciate the artist's work, but I think some of the people in San Francisco might be a little hesitant to take that to their hearts, being as close to him as they were.
It made it a much better piece when he added all these different kinds of parts of Moscone's life. But when you do a commission, you know, you've got to follow what the commission asks for.
He tells me he was very serious when he did the bust of Moscone. He won't admit it, but you get the feeling that he was cut deeply by the rejection of his work. And he just can't understand what all the fuss is about.
When you choose an artist, that it's to be assumed you give him artistic freedom to do the finest work that he's capable of doing, and not just a decoration.
When the whole thing got rolling, I think he was taken back a bit, and it was pretty psychologically wearing on him.
It was a very large controversy in San Francisco. It was on the front page of the Chronicle for a number of days. Herb Caines wrote